Welcome to Left In, the show where two psychology and social theory nerds explore the blind spots, contradictions, and sometimes corrosive dynamics that inhabit and inhibit the modern American left. I'm Hyatt.
And I'm Juniper, and we've both seen how these patterns and practices can result in ineffective or counterproductive strategies, leave us vulnerable to external forces, and even lead us to undermine and attack each other.
In this moment of rising fascism, we think it's more vital than ever to search for and confront our own shortcomings, collectively, interpersonally, and individually.
To successfully build a movement that's strong enough to fight, yet flexible enough to grow, so we can not just imagine a better world, but actually build it.
Hey guys, what's up?
Welcome to our first show. Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
We're launching the podcast with an exploration of interpersonal connection by wading into the complex terrain of sexual consent. At times, consent has been a hot-button issue on the left, and rightfully so when we're talking about safety and bodily autonomy. But we think black and white approaches make things worse, not better. We start by asking some thorny questions like, is consent actually possible under patriarchy? And is it our responsibility to say no?
Then we discuss how the frameworks of affirmative and enthusiastic consent, if approached rigidly, can set unrealistic expectations for what sex should look like. We also challenge some quote-unquote common sense ideas around boundaries and explore how they can keep survivors stuck in a cycle of trauma. At the end of the show, we share some personal reflections on the transformative power of experiencing sex beyond consent.
Hope you enjoy the show and hit subscribe for new episodes every month.
Why don't we start with just trying to say, what's consent generally? When I just think of the concept divorced from any specific scenario, I just think of yes or no. It's just the line between yes and not yes. Maybe it's not yes, so if it's not yes, it's not consent. And then the ability to say no.
I mean, I think for me, the first thought that comes up is sexual consent because my feminist education, I guess, I think of yes means yes kind of stuff and enthusiastic yes. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But I think when I think deeper about it, I think I agree that it's yes. It's not maybe. It's not anything but yes. But the question I think for me is what does that yes look like? Does it have to be enthusiastic? I think, the sociocracy, that definition of consent was kind of what broadened my perception because I was starting to read a lot of Schnarch and thinking more deeply about this, that it's there are things that we're not going to want to do that are going to give us anxiety, but that are important either for our growth or it's if we're balancing I want this thing to continue in my life, a relationship or some, I know it could be anything, but I need to do this thing that I don't really want to do. So how can I give my yes, even though I don't really want to do it, When I think of consent, the first thing that comes to mind is yes means yes kind of stuff. And then
Right.
I start to get a little bit more nuanced in it.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's something that's very concretely defined. It's very nebulous to me. It means yes, but what does yes mean? I think is what, the question that comes up after that.
Yeah, totally. And then you mentioned Schnarch, which is obviously an incredible name.
Yeah, he was a psychologist who merged together the fields of marital and sexual therapy in a modality that he calls the crucible approach. His whole basis is differentiation, which is based on Bowenian differentiation theory. And he took it and he created and applied a therapeutic modality out of that, essentially. And so in this whole crucible approach, a lot of it is about getting into these things that make us uncomfortable and how relationships are a site of personal growth because we push each other's boundaries in this way that we force each other to grow if we value the relationship. And then we have these tensions between our integrity and the relationship. And we have to constantly balance and make these decisions of what of ourselves are we willing to push and grow into and what of ourselves do we need to maintain. If anyone asked me about Schnarch, I could say a million different things about him, about what he did. But in this context, I think that kind of sums up, where I'm coming from and who he is.
Before we jump into more complicated sort of gray areas talking about consent, it feels important maybe to say sort of a bit of a disclaimer in terms of this idea of pushing for stricter definition of consent, developing these models like affirmative consent, enthusiastic consent. It's all comes from trying to address sexual assault,
Right.
which is obviously super important, really fucked up thing to do to somebody and still happens all the time. this is really important stuff. That's why we want to talk about it too.
Right.
And that like the nuance we're trying to bring to it doesn't mean that we think people are dumb or bad for like trying to address this stuff. And we just want to like talk about it and be like, yeah, there's some stuff that feels off to us or this feels really right. And it just felt important to say. And also I know that you come from a background of like trying to address abuse in general, I think. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. Any thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, that being my background, I think that like that's what I was really challenging to me when I started getting into Schnarch and started like kind of questioning this idea of like enthusiastic consent and that like it's just as black and white and rigid as yes means yes, no means no kind of thing. I mean, I think no means no, like period. But do we just like stop there and we don't examine ourselves when we're giving our no? I don't think so.
So one idea we had, it was to start with kind of like a more extreme thing and sort of go from there. It sort of seemed like a fun way to approach it. So there's this mistaken, misattributed, it's not even a real quote, but it's like an interpretation that people had of this feminist figure and writer, Andrea Dworkin. And they took her writing and said, oh, she said that all sex is rape.
Right.
She did not say that. However, it's not like far off from like what she meant.
It's the logical conclusion.
But if you just say it that way, it sounds insane.
Yeah.
There was this Yale Law Review article called Solving the Riddle of Rape by Deception. So it talked about, it wasn't specific about Dworkin, but just like, I think it kind of captured that perspective. So I'll just read this quote here. This quote says, a more radical feminist view argued that the distinction between sex that is violent and nonviolent or consensual or non-consensual is too elusive to ground a robust feminist theory of rape. These more radical scholars argued that it is difficult to distinguish between rape and non-rape in a male-dominated society. To be clear, these scholars didn't argue that all sex is rape, as many have incorrectly suggested. They argue instead that the boundary between bad, rape, and good, sex, are so blurred in our patriarchal society that it is hard to make sense of the distinction. Thus, these scholars were skeptical of theories that presuppose that, quote, rape is definable as distinct from intercourse, end quote. Given that rape and intercourse are difficult for women, quote, to distinguish under the conditions of male dominance, end quote. So, yeah, I'll pause there. Your first reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with this. I have lots of friends have had, I don't know that they're still friends with me. They probably fell off along the way. But I have had friends who believe this, like genuinely believe, you know, under a patriarchal society that there is no such thing as like truly consensual sex because of the power that men hold. If men are holding the like proverbial gun of patriarchy to the head of women, like what choice do women have? I don't know. I think it's a useful analysis, honestly. I do think it's helpful.
Yeah.
I think, again, like if we buy into that completely, it just comes to a very black and white place that's not helpful and not true to like practical reality of how things play out.
Right.
But I think that, you know, if we are examining like the role of sex in a patriarchal society, like that is a totally legitimate analysis and question to bring up. Now, I think that, you know, I think I have known people in my family and like in my life and in my broader communities who buy in, you know. I feel like if you watch like, you know, reality dating shows, you see people who do this. They're like, they're bought in patriarchy as women.
Yes.
And then they choose to climb this social ladder using this as like a form of power that women have, like to hold over men in a way. You know, it's like something that they have to like to offer, I guess, that gives them some kind of capital. And then some people are very...
Or withhold, like sort of...
Or withhold, yeah, absolutely.
Sort of this, right.
And I think that, like, it's interesting, like, some people are very cunning and very wise about how they do it. And they know, I think, you know, just as a quick aside, I will explain what this is before I go into it for anyone who's listening. You know, going back to Schnarch and... mind mapping, which is like mentalization or this way that we map other people. And we have a map of their minds in our minds. And so we navigate our relationship with them based on that map we have of them. And like, there's all kinds of questions about whether or not it's an accurate map. A lot of times we have maps where we see things in people that they don't even see in themselves. And those are vulnerable points that they have. And some people who have really high skills in mind mapping use that to navigate these sorts of situations and gain power and gain control and gain leverage So when I think of consent and this interpretation of it, this idea that men hold power and in a patriarchal society, therefore, like, can you really consent to sex sort of thing? Like, I think of those people and I think of how, like, it's like almost like a survival skill. Like, but would we call that rape?
Right.
Like, and then like the question of like, what about when you take pleasure in it? Like, some people take pleasure in like the game of these things. It's exciting. It's fun, like, to feel like you have this kind of power over someone in this like subversive way. I don't know.
Right.
I don't think I would define that as rape. I know there's lots of people who wouldn't define it themselves. And like, I guess that also begs the question, like, how do you define rape? Is it something that only the person can agree themselves was rape? Or is it something that has like a broader objective definition, So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that feels very complex and I don't have a solid idea or opinion on that. I think it's a useful analysis and I think it's also very limited in its actual application to like real life.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense to me. It's not super, maybe practical is the right word, but it is like really helpful, I think, to like frame sort of the boundaries of the conversation on some, at least a fuzzy boundary. It's interesting that you brought up, women that are bought into patriarchy and use sex as a tool and strategy. Like there's a sexual strategy to gain power as like an example of like, they're not being raped when they have sex with someone to gain power. Like,
right.
It's interesting. It's like there's so much there. At the same time, to be fair, now that like when I was thinking about this, when you were saying, it's like they're just saying you can't define the difference. That's where the all sex is rape thing is like is an inflammatory like interpretation of this, is because they're just saying that like there's not a clear line versus like
right,
they're completely blurred together. I'm like starting to finally make more sense of this in a way that's not like totally insane. It's just that like, where's the line? And therefore consent's not a useful concept because consent doesn't actually draw the line. Like also consent itself is so blurry. So this is a response from this book called Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, Women and Desire in the Age of Consent. And that's by Catherine Angle. So she says, the negotiation of imbalances in power between men and women, between all of us, occurs minute by minute, second by second. And there is no realm, whether sexual or otherwise, in which that act of negotiation is no longer necessary. Whatever we do in sex and elsewhere, we calibrate our desires with those of the other and try to understand what it is that we want. What I got, and we'll get more stuff from her a little later, but like, is this idea of power imbalances are just real. They just exist. They're just going to exist no matter what.
Yep.
And so it's how you navigate them. And I think that's where like, at least the interpretation that people get from like the all sex is rape stuff is it's actually super like, I don't know if disempowering is the right word, but it like sort of tries to take your autonomy away from you.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Like there's power differentials in my relationship with this person. And maybe I think some of them are fucked up, but I also want to have sex with them right now.
Right.
Or I'm going to have sex with them because it gets me this other thing that I want.
Right.
And yeah, I agree that the whole like setup's a little fucked up. But I don't want you to then be like, maybe pinpoint that the like sex itself is really messed up or something. It kind of conforms to like their larger point of like, let's not focus on consent. Let's like focus on the bigger picture. It sort of is that, right? Where it's like, well, the whole thing's a little fucked up, but like, yo, like I'm getting something from this, but maybe it's pleasure, maybe it's intimacy,
social capital.
Social capital, maybe it's, exactly. Like whatever it is. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, that's actually like really interesting because I think that's kind of how I've come to like, I don't know. I didn't see the world this way before I started reading Schnarch. I understood power on like the kind of macro level, and I understood like systems of power. I understood how systems of power on the macro level influence and kind of almost dictate relationships, on the micro level. But I think that like something that I've kind of come to is that relationships, no matter what the cultural context is, patriarchy or no, there is always power, and there's always going to be a power negotiation between people. Like, that's just a fact of life. That's like reality. I don't know why I didn't understand it that way sooner, like because my background is in like social theory, anthropology, in undergrad. And like, and a lot of like, anarchism like draws inspiration from cultures that are egalitarian and have like a horizontal power structure. And even in these societies, there are social and cultural mechanisms to maintain that, equitable division of power, which means that there is inherent power in each individual that we are constantly negotiating in our relationships.
Right.
There are these larger structures like patriarchy and white supremacy and like all of these things that will play into our relationships with each other. I think when you come from the framework that like, if we had no patriarchy, if we had no white supremacy, if we had no ableism, like whatever, then there wouldn't be this power imbalance. Like, that's just not true. I think the fact is that there's always a power imbalance and we're always going to have to negotiate that. And I think there's always going to be bigger social structures that I think are going to impact how far this can go. But I do think on the individual level in relationships that the way we choose to navigate power within these structures can shift these structures in like a ripple effect kind of way, and that they like change us, they change who we are, they change how we relate to others. I feel like, being with Tweety, for instance, has changed the way that I relate to men and how I see men because of how our relationship has changed me and us, together. And I think the process of power negotiation has showed me that, I don't know, I think there's like a lot of flip-flopping on this. Like, I think there's a lot of people who think patriarchy isn't going to come down if not for men doing it themselves. And I think there's some truth. I think we have to do it together. But I also think there's a degree to which like women have to take power back. They have to take their own agency back. There is going to be inherent risk in that, but that like it needs to be done. And that relationships are absolutely a site of this kind of change and the social transformation that I think can ripple out. I don't know. I don't know how far that goes. I'm hopeful. I think I'm optimistic. I believe that someday it'll all come toppling down because we'll have transformed our relationships and we're raising our children to understand these like power imbalances and negotiate them with integrity. But maybe I'm just being optimistic or an idealist.
If it's been done before, I think it can be done again. I think obviously it'll look different just because we have like mass societies and stuff like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question from Learning Good Consent from the piece called Consent Questions. And so the question is, do you think it is the other person's responsibility to say something if they aren't into what you're doing? My gut reaction was yes.
Okay.
My gut reaction was yes. We have to be responsible for what we like and don't and to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's in sort of, it's easy to say yes in an ideal sort of scenario where you feel comfortable saying yes or no, or what's your gut reaction to that? And then we can like get into the more nuances of that. But are you responsible to say something if you're not into what someone's doing?
My gut reaction is kind of. That's my gut reaction. Because I feel like, yes, we are responsible for voicing our discomforts and voicing our boundaries and being clear and direct. This kind of almost goes back to like the legal thing where it's like, we can't there. I don't think there's a black and white answer for this. When I think about things like nonverbal communication and I think about stuff like mind mapping, we are perfectly capable of reading other people. Like, I don't think we are responsible for constantly like checking in over and over. Like, actually, I think that absolutely kills desire and like sexual chemistry and flow. I've had times when I was dealing with pretty severe PTSD where I needed that. I needed check-ins. Like, I would shut down and I couldn't communicate for myself very well. I don't know if couldn't is the correct word. I think it was difficult and I didn't know how to. And I think, being completely honest, there was a part of me that wanted it to be someone else's responsibility to help keep me safe because I felt that I had been so violated in the past that I almost wanted it to prove that like sex can be safe, I don't know if that makes sense.
But you wanted the other person to prove it.
Yeah. And I feel like, looking back, that's like a huge responsibility to put on someone who is not, sexually assaulting me,
Right.
And that's not fair, I think, to put on a partner, anybody who you're trying to have a healthy sexual relationship with. But I think that many things are true. I think that it's true that sometimes, especially when there's like a history of trauma, shutdown is a real thing. And what's amazing, I guess I'll get personal for a moment about it, where like that's something that Tweety helped me work through a lot, is that like I noticed that he is extremely responsive. Like, he notices like little shifts in my body language or my tone where I don't even need to say anything. Like, he'll know like if I'm shutting down or something's wrong, and he'll back off and he'll ask me. And it doesn't have to disrupt the flow. It can be like, oh, are you okay? Oh yeah, I'm fine. And then we continue. Or like, no, I'm actually feeling a little uncomfortable right now. I kind of want to like slow our roll. And that was like incredibly healing for me. And also it made me really angry because I was like, oh, people can do that. It's possible to read people. Like, duh. Like, I read people.
Yeah.
I read people all the time, and like, I'm perfectly capable of asking people, how are you feeling about this? Was this okay? Could this have gone differently? So I think it's complicated, where it's like, ultimately, I think when it comes down to it, we are responsible for voicing our discomfort and our boundaries and being really explicit, because no, people can't read our minds, but people can read us and map us, and they might not know exactly what we're thinking or exactly what's going on. But, like, that's how people take advantage of people, is like, they can read someone and they can say, oh, this person seems like a little nervous, and like, I don't think that they're going to stop me if I do this thing, so I'm just going to do it. And that's where like the context of like mind mapping, I think, is so important to remember, because it's so easy to just be like, oh, well, you didn't say anything, but it's also easy for people to say like, for someone to have said something, you're like, oh, I interpreted it differently. I thought you were saying this, when they understood perfectly what you meant. Or maybe there's a legitimate miscommunication. So I think, my gut reaction to that is like, it's complicated, I think we do need to advocate for ourselves, and speak up for ourselves. I think that's a really good quality to cultivate and important if we're talking about like survivor advocacy, if we're talking about educating and empowering survivors to have, the skills that they need to have healthy romantic and sexual relationships again in the future. That's something that needs to be cultivated. Like, you need to be able to speak up for yourself. You need to know your limits, and you need to be able to speak up for them. Not in like a rigid, oh, like you're toxic for having crossed this boundary kind of way, but in like, hey, I don't really want to do that. They keep pushing. I really don't want to do that, and we need to stop. Like, people need to be able to do that, But at the same time, like, we have to understand that, like, you can't just fall back on that as like an excuse for like violating somebody. For sure. When we know that like sometimes people aren't going to be comfortable speaking up, or maybe there's just a context where like someone isn't able to, or whatever, like, I think we also need to be responsible for being responsive and noticing how other people are like responding to us, I guess. There's shared responsibility, I think.
Yeah, that's where I was totally like thinking as well. It's like my gut reaction's yes, but it's like yes, and like the other person's also responsible, like to you to like be responsive, like, and try. And it's like to say something. I think I don't like the framing of that. Let's expand that. Say something or communicate. Communicate doesn't have to be verbal. When you were like, people need to learn how to say, no, I don't like that, or, oh, I don't know, and then being like, okay, you need to stop. Like, I don't like that. It doesn't mean they need to say that in order for it to be the other person's like fault or whatever. Like, they need to say that in the sense that like, if you want to have the best chance of like something stopping if you don't like it, is to like communicate it, like, of course, right? And especially if it's something that's like maybe in a normal context, like nowhere near the realm of like something abusive. It's just like, oh, I just don't really like that. And then it's like, oh, but you're violating a boundary. And it's like, oh shit, I had no idea though. And at the same time, it's like, if you're like able to tell what's like a little bit of like, are you getting a response? I think this is like a decent segue into sort of talking about the enthusiastic consent model. It's obviously a pretty popular model. It was like taking it beyond affirmative consent, meaning yes means yes, no means no. Starting with, I think it's Antioch College came up with this framework. It was like one of the first college like sort of consent frameworks. And they were talking about like explicit verbal consent. They got like lampooned on SNL, and it's like a bit unfair. Like, may I kiss you? May I touch you? But it's within the realm of like what they're sort of talking about. Like when they write it out and they're like, every time you move to a further escalated, intimate level of sexual interaction, like you need to ask verbally and get a yes. And that's sort of where affirmative consent started. Maybe we can just like respond to that first. Because it's not where things are now. And to pretend that like everyone believes that on the left or something would be totally not true. But it is a place that started, and some people do still say that you should do that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know you already mentioned that like one, that's just like really not sexy to you. What else comes up for you when you hear the idea of you need to ask for a yes at every sort of increasing level of like intimacy or different, or just even different sex acts? You don't have to put it on some scale of intimacy.
I mean, I think it can be helpful in certain contexts, like especially if you are like coming from like a trauma background and you're like specifically dealing with sexual trauma. Like sometimes that can be like a kind of way to create a container that can make sex feel safer when you feel like you're ready to branch into that or whatever. But I don't know. I mean, I when I hear that, I'm like, I understand the intention is to prevent rape, to prevent sexual assault, to prevent like consent violations, I guess. But it's just like not practical. There's nothing practical about it.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't think there's anything that feels natural about it to most people. And so because of that, like, I don't think that's, obviously going to be a way that we can turn that into like a normal part of like sexual like meeting of people, I guess. I don't know how to say that. But like, I think, there are aspects of it that can be definitely helpful. It's just that like, it's again, I think always coming back to like the black and white thinking and the rigidity where it's like, this can be helpful in certain contexts. I even think it can be helpful to like, as a practice for people who have been maybe socialized as male and see sex in a certain way and engage in sex in a certain way. For them to like turn on that like pattern of thinking, hey, I should tune into someone who's not me in this sexual interaction, I think that like it could be used as a tool for sure. But yeah, I'm glad that doesn't seem to be the consensus anymore.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with you in the sense that it's like important for some people. If that's what you want, you can like ask for that.
Yeah.
And I think that's like totally valid. Of course, if that's what you like or need in order to feel good having sex, that makes sense to me. There's nothing like inherently wrong about it, but I agree that it feels a little unrealistic. And also that I like what you were saying of forcing, usually it's men who aren't thinking about the other and being like, oh, wait, does the other person actually want this?
Right.
It's also just like a way to be like pretty sure, because of course the yes can be elicited without it really being fundamentally a yes. There's a lot of reasons. But like, it's sort of this like way of being like, more sure that you're not like violating someone's consent.
Yeah.
But then I think the problem with it, and like we said, it's like, this is not where things are typically at anymore. Although legally it can be. The problem with it is that like people are going to be like, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. And then they're probably going to throw the whole thing out the window.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then legally it's become a thing where like I was reading this book called Sexual Citizens, a landmark study on sex, power, and assault on campus. And it was like a study done at Columbia. There were people who were like, yeah, I like got someone to like sign a thing, or in New York State, it's legal for me to like record someone without their consent. So I will record them saying that they like consent to sex with me.
Wow.
Because if the burden of proof becomes, and I don't want to get way deep into legal stuff, but if the burden of proof becomes that you have to prove that the other person said yes, then that's intense. That's really scary, understandably very scary. And look, there's way more people that are like getting assaulted and then nothing happening, and like people sort of getting away with it, if you will. There not being any like appropriate response to those situations. At the same time, it's like, that makes sense that's a little scary. It's like, oh, I have to prove that the other person said yes.
Right.
So anyway, getting away from the legal stuff, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I wish that the model had started where it sort of is now in terms of like at least the affirmative consent. And then we'll separately talk about like enthusiasm and like the saying like you have to get enthusiasm. But like affirmative being like a yes, whether verbally or non-verbally.
Right.
And I think that actually like pretty aligned with that, right? I'm like, okay, yeah, like if it doesn't have to be verbal, gauging whether the other person, and it doesn't have to neither does it have to be as explicit as a nod, but sort of like, okay, the other person is like, there's no like resistance here. And there's like enjoyment. We're still vibing. There's still a connection. That feels like pretty good to me. And I realized like, even though my gut reaction to like the responsibility thing was like, yeah, it's your responsibility if you don't like something. Well, at the same time, like in reality, what do I do? It's just like, oh yeah, like I'm like attuned or trying to as best I can attune to what the other person is feeling and enjoying. And if they don't like it, like I don't like it. I'm like, oh, this doesn't feel good anymore to me. And I'm like, oh, well, what's going on here? You know, it's like, what's coming up for you?
I think the framing of it is so much about like avoiding, consent violations that like it feels stuffy. I think about mind mapping, and I think about antisocial empathy, which, quickly I can go into that. Schnarch had his definition of empathy is our ability to read other people essentially and understand what they could be thinking, what they're feeling. And antisocial empathy is when we use our ability to read other people for the purposes of, it could be harming them to get what we want. It could be harming them because we want to harm them and we enjoy how it feels to hurt people. And that's not just something evil people do. That's something that everybody does. Like And the ways that people say things, like, you're hearing words, you're hearing like objective words, but there's also like tone behind it. And there's also so much meaning behind it. And there's so much reading and mapping of each other that's going into that. It's like, I don't know how you put something clear and definitive on something like consent when it is so complex. And I think that's where like I find the Schnarch framework so groundbreaking to me as someone with a background in survivor advocacy and transformative justice stuff, where like we acknowledge that there is so much more to it.
Yeah. You know, we're starting with like talking about affirmative consent, going into like enthusiastic consent, which adds this extra layer of like enthusiasm, right? Like being like, get an enthusiastic yes. Now, the way they like role play it and stuff and write out these scripts is like, to me, like a little insane, because they're like, oh yeah, and you can make it sexy. And it's like, okay, this is not sounding very sexy to me. Like, yeah, okay, you can make them beg for it. And it's like, oh, come on. Like, yeah, of course I know what you mean, and that could be sexy, but like, this is so corny and lame and weird. But in terms of like, if sort of what I was saying about the affirmative consent, where it's like, okay, maybe I'm not verbally explicitly asking for things, although like often I am. When I reflect, I'm like, wait, I do often ask, you know. It's like with particularly, I would say, like going from like foreplay to like intercourse, you know. It's just like it does feel really important to me with someone like new, you know, if I've never had sex with a person before. I think beyond that, it's like a little bit more depending on the relationship. It can be totally, you don't have to like ask because you're like leading up to it and you feel comfortable with each other to like get like you're attuned, where you're like, oh, I can sort of tell that you don't want this, or you feel comfortable saying if you don't want it.
Right.
In terms of like, what do I look for? If I'm like having sex with someone, like enthusiasm, not necessarily in the yes before doing something, but in the act of like doing it.
Right.
It's like, of course I'm looking for that. If I don't get that, I'm immediately noticing that I'm like, ooh, I don't know what's going on. Now I'm like a little bit like, this doesn't feel good to me, because that doesn't seem to be necessarily feeling bad to the other person, but they don't seem to be super into it. So I'm like, oh, how do I change this? How do I do it? So it kind of makes me wish like, yes, it's more complicated, it's more nuanced, but it's more real. Like if they fucking change the model, instead of like putting these like sort of ridiculous things that people are going to be like, that's fucking stupid. But be like, how do we like that? You know, how do we like see if the other person's into it? And of course, the other side of the line where it's like they're not into it is like, okay, like really like slow down and or stop or whatever, you know? And, but also I want to acknowledge that like where it started was at sex parties.
Right.
In that kind of context, I get the idea of being like, whoa, like get an enthusiastic yes, ask clearly if you can get consent, like if you can do this to someone. Pulled out of that context into like day-to-day scenario, it feels a little bit like clunky and like a little like something that will get tossed out the door by people just like, that's ridiculous. I'm not even going to get close to that. Right. And so it feels a little unfortunate because it's like, I think people can handle more nuanced, like nuanced models.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you can't just like sit someone down who's like has a totally different mindset. You know, I'm thinking of like, I don't know, some like frat bro who just like wants to like, you know, have sex with a lot of girls and just doesn't care. It's like, it's like, you know, his sexual project as like, is very interesting. The Sexual Citizens book talks about like sexual projects and like we all have different things that we want to get. And it doesn't have to just be like intimacy or love or whatever, or like pleasure. It can be like status and access to whatever, you know, numbers. It can be a lot of, it can be a lot of things. But you know, you're probably not going to get through to someone who's like, going to a mandatory like workshop and being like, you should care about like how what the other person feels and stuff. But it's like, it's not like it's not like you shouldn't try. And like, how do you actually do sex education a different way? And I think it like is a big can of worms.
I don't know. Like, I think the framing of it is so much about like avoiding, you know, consent violations that like, I feel stuffy. I don't know. I don't know how else to like really describe it. But I don't want to like, you know, shit on people who are doing consent education in this way. You know, if you're talking to kids like who don't have maybe the capacity for that, like, I guess, nuance, you know, because they're not cognitively there yet. That's one thing. You know, if I'm talking to like my child who's, you know, 9 now, but when he was younger, it's like you speak in black and white terms, like people don't touch each other there. Like, versus like, oh, well, adults might, but, you know, they shouldn't touch you. It's like, you know, you don't want that nuance when you have a 3-year-old. You want them to know if anyone ever touches you in this way, if it makes you feel uncomfortable in your tummy or whatever, like, you tell me. Like, they don't need to know all the nuance. They just need to know that's wrong, you know? But when we're talking about adults, like, that's completely different. I think we need to be able to expand their capacity to have a more like nuanced perspective on things and to understand, like, am I giving of myself in a way that feels like mutual and reciprocal? Does it feel like we're both coming from this healthy, grounded place? We're both trying to grow as people. There is give and take. And we really are both dedicated to each other. And that's why we're giving of ourselves, because we want to continue this relationship and we value each other. Or am I giving and giving and giving? Is this control? Like, all that kind of stuff. And I actually do think, like, it can be harmful to have this messaging that is so black and white, because it just reinforces like a mindset that it makes you vulnerable to abuse.
In this case, obviously, like sexual abuse, because we're talking about consent, sexual consent.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Because my background is in survivor advocacy, like working with survivors. I've helped many survivors escape abusive relationships. I've been a contact person for people in active crisis after, things like sexual assault and abuse. So that's kind of like the background. And I have training in survivor advocacy. So that's kind of like where the worlds that I'm coming from.
So you're like, that's black and white, that actually could cause harm because, like, it doesn't actually map on to the way people live their lives and think about this stuff. So then it becomes confusing and then leads to more issues.
I think that what it does is it doesn't actually give you healthy relational skills. Like, it doesn't help you understand what a real healthy relationship looks like. And this was like a learning experience for me when I first started dating Tweety. I was coming from that mindset. And so I was like on high alert, like 1 foot in, 1 foot out for like, a good year and a half in the beginning, where I'm like watching for signs that he's abusive and like trying to figure out and navigate, like, what does it mean? Like, if a boundary's crossed, what if my feelings get hurt? What if he says something that offends me? Like, how do we deal with that? Like, does it mean he's a bad person? Like, and what if he gets like angry or upset that I expressed a boundary, or that I'm upset? Like, does that mean he's toxic? And then figuring out like, no, actually it's really normal to feel hurt or offended or upset when you find out that you cross someone's boundary. Like, that sucks to hear. Like, it's not fun. An abuser will react in a certain way to that. Like, that's going to involve like high control and maybe threats and coercion or emotional manipulation or whatever.
Right.
I mean, I think that people who aren't necessarily abusers can and do that stuff all the time too.
Yes.
But, like a normal kind of healthy, grounded person might be upset, but they also will go through the process. And like, it's like how you respond to each other and deal with that shows who you are as people, and shows like how like grounded you are, I guess, if that makes sense. You're constantly scanning. Like, I think that's the other thing too, is like, when we come into like survivor advocacy and education after like abuse or assault or whatever, from this black or white framework, we're not giving people the capacity to like read other people accurately. And we're also like reinforcing hypervigilance. Like, we're reinforcing that trauma, which is what happened to me, I think. I felt like my trauma was reinforced by that, because like, one of the diagnostic criteria, I think, of PTSD, I'm pretty sure what hypervigilance and like constantly like that constant scanning and looking for these like environmental dangers, and like it's part of the diagnosis. And so like, for me, actually, like, working on my differentiation, like, I no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD any longer, because I have worked on my capacity to have that like flexibility and that nuance. I'm not constantly scanning for danger, because I know that like I can navigate things. Like, I have that solid, flexible sense of self. I don't see like someone say something and immediately think, oh, they're a bad person, they're an abuser, they're trying to control me, they're trying to gaslight me, whatever. Like, I know that I can handle that. And I know that people do behave in shitty ways, and it's fine. Like, it's not fine, but like, I know how to deal with it,
Right.
And like, I have that flexibility, and I'm not like looking to like pigeonhole people into these categories of good or bad. And I think that kind of black or white framework like forces us to do that, and it makes our trauma worse. Like, at least for me, it did. And I know a lot of people who seem like they're not doing well, they're traumatized and they're not doing well. And they have this very rigid, narrow way of looking at the world, which is both trauma, and then it's reinforced again by this kind of black and white way of seeing the world, and the way that we think that we need to like make the world perfect, so that it's safe for everybody,
Right.
Like, that's not possible.
Yeah, totally. It just makes sense that if you're like always trying to figure out if someone's doing something fucked up or not, to just be like constantly on alert, then triggered a lot, right? It's just, oh, they're doing something fucked up, and then it like is going to bring everything back. So
Right.
I actually really liked, let me see if I can find it here. Well, there's a lot of great stuff from like survivors and like sort of that perspective in that book, Learning Good Consent. So let's see. I guess I'll just start at the top. So the information that you receive from your body in the form of sensations, feelings, and intuition is key to the process of making choices. Survivors learn to override their feelings and acquiesce to others' wishes. You can decide what you want sexually based on your own needs, desires, and values. And this writer is calling that embodied consent. They continue, sometimes we make choices about sex in our heads because it seems like a good idea, when we may be feeling something entirely different in our bodies. You can end up feeling used, angry, or self-loathing after such a decision. Consent does not always feel comfortable, easy, and joyous. Sometimes a consensual experience can bring up sadness, anger, or feelings of abandonment. It is important to learn the difference between experiencing feelings and wanting to stop what you're doing. I think that makes sense in the sense of like your body and your emotions like contain a lot of information. But it's interesting here, like one thing that I took from this is sort of talking about having a consensual relationship with yourself. But also that just because you consented in the moment doesn't mean that you'll like feel like awesome about it after or like even during it. But also it doesn't mean the other person like violated you. It's like this gray area. So in terms of sort of navigating sexual trauma and like what that can bring up for somebody, like I'll just read this quote. What about maybe? Sometimes there are a number of seemingly contradictory feelings happening in your body at once. Actually, experiencing contradictory feelings is familiar territory for most survivors. Consent then becomes a matter of distinguishing what sensations are what. So a quote from a person in one of this person's workshops. I am anxious when I am getting close to someone. I can count on this happening. It does not mean I do not want to be sexual. And then another survivor talking about how their stomach can get tight because of they have a history of sexual molestation. But they realized through this workshop that, oh, my stomach being tight doesn't mean I don't want to have sex with this person. It's just a reaction that's going to happen. And sort of it's like navigating the maybe, right? And it's like, oh, maybe doesn't mean no. And like doing that work within yourself. And I imagine that that's really powerful work to do, right? To be able to be like, I'm understanding what's going on within me. And it doesn't mean I can't have like an intimate connection with this person that I want to have an intimate connection with. And so you're not being blocked by this like trauma history.
Totally.
To be able to have something beautiful with someone now. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's like, you know, getting yourself into those situations like helps you to get to know those like reactions that you're going to have too. Like, you know, I know that's just like, I think that's a really beautiful clarity, like knowing like, oh, my stomach gets tight. Like it just happens, you know, and I feel like, you know, those are things that I've noticed for me too. Like, I'm like, oh, you know, when this thing happens, I feel this way, but maybe not all the time or whatever. And like knowing that like, oh, this is just going to happen, like makes it quieter, you know, over time. The more that you acknowledge and accept that and don't feel like you have to like freeze up against it, and like also know that like many things can be happening in your body at the same time, like the desire to engage in a like intimacy and also your stomach gets tight, you know, like those things can coexist. And like, I mean, I feel like that's definitely important trauma healing work, is like getting out of like the frozenness and the stuckness and being able to be with yourself in many different ways at one time.
Right. Not to mention that like even someone without sexual trauma might feel like anxious or something in a sexual encounter.
Absolutely.
Like, of course. I think that's like super normal as well.
Yeah.
Speaking to triggers, because I think sometimes like this can get into a little bit of the more like lefty sort of some parts of the left where people are like, you're like, yeah, let's do this. And then you're like, that wasn't that great, or like, I really didn't like that. And so the other person like harmed me. Right. Like, I know that's a pattern that I do want to like really like kind of be like, I think that's like a little off here. Not to say that like the other person didn't do something harmful always in every context, but like, I think often it seems just like someone gets triggered by something someone's doing or just didn't enjoy it or something. And maybe after the fact is like, I feel like I was harmed because of that. It's just like sex and suck, and that's not necessarily like because the other person did something sort of harmful or hurtful to you, and therefore there should be some kind of like consequences or whatever to that. Yeah, what do you think of that kind of thing? Like, I'm not making this up, right?
No, not at all. That's stuff that I've even like wondered about. I think because of both the trauma history for myself and also just the discourse around consent and like the time that I was learning about it, 2010s, 15s, whatever. I don't know. I can only speak for myself, but speaking from experience, I think that I do extrapolate this onto others that I see where I see this happening. I think that like there's like a sense of powerlessness, when you're coming from a trauma history, especially if you come from like a trauma history where you cannot distinguish between, first of all, can't distinguish between yourself and others. And you can't distinguish between, I don't want to say good and bad. You can't distinguish between like your feelings and like actual harm. And it's like everything feels like this like weird soup, that's how I experienced like codependency and enmeshment. Like that's how it felt to me. Like I never knew like, oh, if someone else's feelings are hurt because of something I did, I must be bad. I must have done something wrong. But wait, also they're bad because they're making me feel bad for making them feel bad. And it's like, there's no clarity. Like what's yours? What's mine? Where do these things interlap? Like what's your responsibility? What's my responsibility? And when you're not clear on those things, especially when you come from like sexual trauma and that kind of enmeshment trauma, I think that in a way, doing that is a way of like, I want to say taking power back. Like it's a way of like shifting the power dynamic in a way that feels safe for you. I don't know if that makes sense. And I think it's not okay to do. I think it's a really fucked up thing to do, actually.
Right.
But like, I do think it's like a way of like trying to like maintain a sense of power and agency when you have like no idea like what the fuck is happening, and you don't feel safe unless you feel like you have some kind of power and control over your own body. That's where I believe that comes from. I think there's also like, I think when I say that's a way of like maintaining a sense of like power and control and agency over your own body, like it almost sounds like innocent, like I don't know if that's the right word, but it sounds like innocent intentions. But I think there can also be nefarious intentions too, where it's like a very common dynamic of enmeshment is like triangulation. There's like the victim, perpetrator, and savior kind of thing. And so like you're enacting like those dynamics by doing that. You don't know what to do with your feelings. You feel overwhelmed. You feel triggered, whatever. And you have no idea how to manage that. You don't know what's what, who's is who's, and you're not clear on any of that. So obviously there must be a victim there and you have to be the victim because you're hurt. So that person's the perpetrator. And then in doing that, because people who do that aren't usually being quiet about it. Like obviously, if we know it happens, people are talking about it. So in doing that, they're pulling in like saviors, someone to make them feel lifted up and in the right, and like, oh, that person's bad. That person did something bad. You're totally valid. Like, it's this kind of like automatic I think it can be really unconscious in a lot of ways. And I think there is like a self-protection that does feel almost innocent, but then there also is kind of a more nefarious element to it as well. And so like, I think, that I get tripped up talking about this stuff sometimes because I feel the discourse around it is so polarized that there isn't room for both of those things to be true. And I think like, the antisocial and pro-social empathy thing, understanding that this is inherent in all of us, it doesn't mean that we're bad or that we're good or whatever. Like it just is like helps me personally to like grapple with it in a more complex way because like I can understand that like a person can be protecting themselves, a person can be engaging in like survival behaviors, and those survival behaviors could have completely nefarious intentions to harm someone else to lift themselves up. You know what I mean? Like,
of course,
both of those things can be true. It doesn't mean that like, oh, survivors are manipulative and they're lying and they're making stuff up and they're just trying to hurt other people. Although I'll say it like that happens. That happens,
Of course, everyone's capable of hurting other people.
Yeah, and I think that like the fact that we can't like talk about that in like survivor advocacy work is really a big problem. I think it's a huge problem actually. But I think that people will hear that and they'll think that you're saying that about all survivors in all situations, or that you're saying that people who do that are bad people, or that they're the real manipulators, or they're the real abusers, when like none of that is actually being said. Like all I'm saying is that these are complex situations, and that like that when I hear stuff like that, I assume that there is some kind of trauma response and possibly some kind of triangulation happening,
That's really interesting. one thought I had was just that I wanted to be like, oh yeah, so like I think it's important and people forget that like trigger, if I'm triggered, that literally means something now is bringing up something from the past.
Right.
So it's possible that something now is also bad. That's totally possible. But like so often what's happening is that like literally just trauma from the past is being brought into the current moment and you're experiencing that. And the other person often, I would say, I don't want to necessarily say, but like I think often is like not doing anything like wrong. They're just happening to bring up something or not doing something that makes them like, I don't know, just
a
like,
bad person.
Oh, you're doing, or at least, okay, maybe the thing I could say is the response you're having is disproportionate compared to what's happening in the moment. Literally, that's the point of a trigger. And it doesn't mean you're bad. It just means that you're experiencing something beyond what's going on in the moment. And I think people forget that and blame other people for triggering them. And it's like, of course, it's nuanced, right? It's not a yes or no here.
Yeah.
But it's also like, it seems like it's gone, you know, we're kind of trying to bring it back a little bit from being like, if you're triggered, then someone did something bad to you. It's just like, yeah, like, no. That's like way too far in the other direction. And
for sure.
So I think that's really, you know, that is important in that context.
Yeah.
Is there a place we're landing with this? I feel like we reached some interesting, like, sort of places that I hadn't been before. Do you have some stuff that you're taking away from today? Sort of anything that shifted for you?
I mean, I think, you know, just like, I feel like I'm always circling back to differentiation, you know. I mean, I wrote a whole manifesto about it. You can read it on my website. And I really believe in it. I really believe in differentiation as a framework that we need to like infuse into the fabric of our communities. We need to teach it to our children. We need to teach it to each other. We need to work on it with each other and like set these very like clear intentions of growing our differentiation. Because like when we're talking about consent, when we're talking about all these different frameworks, like so much of it leads to this rigidity. It leads to black and white thinking. It's not practical. It doesn't actually even address the issue of these people who are doing these nefarious things. But differentiation does. Like differentiation helps people who could be potential victims to protect themselves. It helps them have the skills to protect themselves and have healthy relationships and know when they're not healthy, which lessens the pool of potential victims that these nefarious intentioned people have. And it just is a dynamic kind of way of engaging with something like intimacy. Is just so much more helpful than like, yes, like enthusiastic, yes, verbal, yes, like all of these things. Like they're not actually helpful tools that help people cultivate the skills that they need to cultivate to have healthy and fulfilling relational experiences, sexual or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, and just like sort of the realization of like enthusiastic consent, if you adjust the framework thing where it's just like, oh, well, if you're looking for enthusiasm, not necessarily having to ask for it ahead of time, but as you're navigating, making sure everyone seems to be having a good time. It sort of goes back to the communicative sex thing that the law paper sort of actually addressed in part of it, where it's just like communication, mutuality of desire, connection is the goal. And it's like, oh yeah, when you have that, it's like you're not even really thinking about consent.
Yeah.
That was definitely one thing that kind of clicked for me, which is like kind of cool. Not that like changing sex education is going to fix everything, but like, I don't know, it's not a bad idea to be like, okay, well, if you present it this way, then people now with younger kids, like you said, be more black and white.
Yes.
As kids get older, be like, yeah, like, look, we're not asking you to be like, fucking be like, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Because that's ridiculous. We get that, like, for the most part, most people aren't going to want that. So look for like, you know, and then of course there's the larger stuff. How do you grow, say, men, because men are often the ones like sort of like trying to get consent, trying to get sex. How do you develop a societal like sort of masculinity that is like about like that gives a shit about the other like not just gives a shit, but like really cares what the other person's thinking, feeling, and wants connection and wants intimacy and mutual like pleasure and connection, all that kind of stuff, right? So consent is important, and it's like important and so narrow. It's so just the starting point, right? And that almost gets us back to the fact that it's like it's just a yes and nothing more in a way, right? It's literally just the first step toward like a larger vision of the world that like feels way better. And then you're not even thinking about consent. It's like it's not it's just so foundational that like, you know, everything you're doing is like within that, I guess. Or like anyway, you know what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to read this last quote. It's a quote from Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. So, to be met in one's desire and to be surprised in one's desire is an exercise in mutual trust and negotiation of fear. When it works, it can feel miraculous. Because it's rare, it should be treasured. Letting go in sex, letting oneself go to places of intensity, to the hair's breadth space between knowing and not knowing what we want, between controlling the action and letting the action take over, involves placing an immense burden of trust on the other, trusting them to renounce their liberty to abuse. I trust you, we want to be able to say, not to hurt me. I trust you not to abuse your power. This is, of course, immensely difficult, wishful perhaps. We're lucky if we have even fleeting moments like this. I find that like very moving. I'm like, it makes me tear up. Just it's like, oh yeah, that's right. Like sex is like it can be so intimate, so powerful. And I don't know, I feel lucky to have experiences like this, It's just like, it does make me sad to think that like, yeah, a lot of people, it's like, oh, right. A lot of people don't get to have this because they're not willing to be vulnerable. They're not doing the work on themselves.
Yeah.
This is like really, it's beautiful to me. And I think it's a great vision of like, oh yeah, like what can we get? It's like so much if we like can shift things or just shift things for ourselves, right? And that's the beauty of like, okay, yeah, societal shifts are ideal, but like we can do our own work, differentiation being like one part of that, just general like working on ourselves, doing therapy and like healing work can lead to deeper and more powerful connection with people that can be like so fulfilling, even if the world at large is like not able to.
Totally. I mean, I think about that a lot, like especially like as like, the ways that like we foster our ability to be intimate and vulnerable with people and to be safe together. I always like kind of feel like this like push against the word safe because I think that like it kind of evokes this like idea that like we need to not like make each other feel anxious or bad or whatever. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that part of it is the risk, part of it is the risk of going into something and not knowing, will I be accepted? Will I be seen? Will I be rejected? I don't know. And that's like why it's so important to work on self-validation. But when you can have those like, Schnarch called them moments of meeting, they change you, they completely change you as a person. And I feel like it's crazy. Like the work that I have done in like my intimate relationship with Tweety, like has made me a better friend, like a better mother. Like I just am able to meet people and see people in a way that like I couldn't have without having done that work, So I totally feel that. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And that speaks to sort of the interrelation between like, it's not like, oh, this will just be like a thing that it benefits your intimate relationship. It's like everything is connected and ripples out. I find that like when I have a better relationship with myself, which is like a place we can really start, right? And it's like sort of that's ultimately our responsibility. When I can have that, then I can have that with other people. When I can have that with my partner, with my friends, with strangers, like whatever, it like really ripples out, So.
Yeah.
Well, that's a wrap for our first episode of Left In.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as we did.
New episodes drop every month. Hit subscribe so you don't miss out.
We'd love to know how this landed for you. Did it affirm something, challenge something, open up new questions? Drop us a line. We read every message.
Find us on Instagram at LeftInPod. Thanks, y'all. See you next episode.